Today we're going to be talking about archaeology and hunting in New Mexico. Probably my two biggest passions here combined into one presentation. So if I can't talk about this, I shouldn't be able to talk about anything in my life, because God gifted me with two skills, one of which is a love of archaeology and the other of which is a love of hunting. And fortunately, I'm fairly good at least those two things as best I can. So what do I mean by an archaeological perspective on hunting in New Mexico? Well, hunting, regardless of what you may hear and how people talk about hunting, hunting is not necessarily a profession or a skill set. If we look at hunting throughout time, it's actually a cultural expression. It's an ethnological trait. If you say hunting, hunting doesn't mean you use a bow. It doesn't mean you use a gun. Hunting doesn't refer to one animal. Rather, hunting and how you look at hunting depends upon the culture you're in, your notions of hunting, what it represents, and that changes through time. But hunting has always been a pivotal activity for Native American groups from the Paleo-Indian period to the present day. Everybody in the Americas has hunted. Now, what they chose to hunt, how they chose to hunt it, has changed. And because of this, we can look at hunting in the archaeological record as an expression of culture. How does hunting appear in the archaeological record? Well, it appears in many different ways. The picture you see there is of something that looks pretty unremarkable on the landscape, a couple stacked stones. What that is a prehistoric hunting blind over Clark Draw in the Cook's Range of southwestern New Mexico. Types of archaeological evidence can include things like this blind. It can include overall geospatial and chronometric data or distribution of human occupation. It can include landscape and human manufactured features. So the location of a river, a landscape feature, can help us inform upon the archaeology of hunting. Certainly flake stone, fauna analysis, the analysis of bones, and then also the analysis of human beings. Nutritional deficiencies and occupational injuries are often evident on human remains and can tell us a lot about what people were doing with their bodies or what they weren't eating with their bodies, as it were. There's a lot of other things, and we're going to talk about some of the ways archaeologists piece together hunting and how hunting occurs and what different people are doing for hunting. Oh, goals of this lecture. Okay, so we're going to look at three major goals within this hour. First, I'm going to talk about the major periods of New Mexico history for Native American peoples. Those are the Paleo-Indian, Archaic, Pueblo, and Historic periods. And we're going to be talking about how hunting strategies existed during those times. And I am going to use the word evolved because this is very much, this lecture, in my perspective, comes out of an evolutionary ecology perspective. Most of my resource acquisition writing is heavily based on human evolutionary ecology. So you'll see certain traits and certain things, the way I discuss them are based primarily, in this lecture at least, on a highly scientific level and looking at numbers, not so much a human choice or the expressions of humans in culture as art. But we're going to be looking at how changes occur over time and why they develop in the first place. But then also we're going to look at how humans in the American Southwest and in New Mexico in particular diverge on their hunting strategies. So why you have contemporaneous ethnic groups or cultural groups with different strategies, and how these strategies of these different groups shape interactions between the communities, how hunters and gatherers interact with farmers, Pueblo peoples, during the period of the Pueblo period. How do farmers and hunters and gatherers interact, and vice versa? How do the arrival of Europeans impact these patterns? One thing I'm not going to talk about is gender. Well, many of the pictures here are going to show men hunting. And hunting is often viewed through some sort of caveman lens, that it's some sort of male, which is problematic in and of itself. Hunting is often viewed as a male enterprise, but it isn't. people take notions today, and yes, hunting is very popular amongst men today. There are a substantial number of women getting back into this as a recreational activity. And some people have taken these 19th century gender roles or early 20th century gender roles that the women's places at home and so on and so forth, and they've pushed these back through time. However, archaeological and archival data shows that gender roles can be rather fluid and change rapidly to meet a number of cultural and environmental factors. So women have always played a role in hunting. Even if a male kills an animal, and we were to use ethnographic analogy, most often it's the women that butcher and cook and preserve the meat. So even today, if we use ethnographic analogy from the male-centric 19th century, women have a place in hunting. This is not something that should ever be viewed as something, well, hunting, that's something men do. It's something humans do. And it's something that reflects back on human culture, not on a male bias per se. So let's start with the narrative. Now, hunting in New Mexico was actually easier to explain up until about 20 or 30 years ago. 20 to 30 years ago, the narrative was there was a land bridge, and people came across through the land bridge. Of course, the land bridge went right through central Canada. So these are people that were living inland. They were hunting terrestrial animals. And of course, these guys would have been hunting big game. You know, they're moving from the Arctic and they're hunting big game in the forests and in the plains. That's probably not the case. More realistically, the interpretation for humans migrating into the Americas now is largely based on a coastal migration hypothesis. Which actually works better. You'd expect, as we'll get into in the next slide, you'd expect that if there was a land bridge hypothesis, the earliest evidence of Clovis culture would occur in central Canada, and it doesn't. Instead, people are along the coast. These are not Clovis peoples. These are some peoples that date before Clovis. And they get into a lot of different areas, including California during that time period, but they're moving down along the coast. And maybe they even get as far south as Chile and so on. There's some debate on that. I'm not going to even point out the fallacy of the Solutrean hypothesis, but you can see it on there. It's a terrible idea, but if you like that idea, that's fine. Most likely, they're on the coast. They're hunting sea life. That includes mammals and sea mammals. That includes fish and stuff like that. Eventually, these guys, using archaeological evidence, these guys make their way down to Sonora. I know it sounds weird to think of Sonora as the gateway to the American Southwest, but it is. So the Sonora area at this time period, the Paleo-Indian time period, was actually like a giant swamp. And the first evidence we see of Clovis culture is actually hunting these animals that are kind of like mammoths. They're called gomphthere, and I'm probably saying that word terribly wrong, but it looks like an elephant. And the Clovis culture appears to these coastal hunters and gatherers kind of move inland into this marsh area, and they're probably still taking eels and whales and stuff like that, but they start taking these large terrestrial mammals, which they take through an ambush kind of strategy. They kind of living on the edges of the marshes with these animals, and they start to kill them. A recent book called Los Primeros Mexicanos does a great job of kind of outlining this kind of pattern that we see with Clovis culture, and kind of points out that the Sonora area seems to be a hotbed for Clovis culture in Mexico, but then also possibly as the gateway into the American Southwest around 10,000 BC. And of course, that's coming by way of the San Pedro Valley in southeastern Arizona, and then into New Mexico from there. Now, the Paleo-Indian period in New Mexico is usually classified into like three major phases: Clovis, Folsom, and Plano. The period as a whole, which lasts over 5,000 years, is really a time period in which people are moving around on the landscape looking for big game. They're eating lots of different things, but they're moving around in the landscape. They're placing their shelters in places where they expect these large game to occur. And they're hunting these with a large projectile point, a spear point, being thrown from an atlatl, which is a spear thrower. The projectile points of the period are known specifically by the time period. So Clovis points, you can see there, Folsom points, you've got Plainview points. There's some later Paleo-Indian points as well. These are big, heavy dart points. It can only be shot relatively short distances. So you're talking about a very large animal that you're getting very close to. And the image down below is an atlatl. If you don't know what an atlatl looks like, it kind of extends the length of your arm and allows you to throw these spears or darts. They're actually, I mean, technically it's a dart. Though when we think of darts, we think of like in a bar throwing a very small thing. These are actually very large darts, usually about 3 to 4 feet in length, mounted with a huge stone point on them. But relatively effective technology that means getting in close with the animal. With the type of point being diagnostic to the time period. So for example, during the Clovis period, they're making Clovis points. During the Folsom period, they're making Folsom points, and so on and so forth. Paleo hunting strategies evolve over the time period. What we initially see, specifically during the Clovis period and the Folsom period to some extent, especially in the Albuquerque area, is that people are on the landscape. They're hanging out around those marshes and shallow lakes. So they move up from Sonora, and they're still using those same environments that they were familiar with in Mexico. Sometimes these shallow lakes are known as playas in the area. All these lakes are now extinct in the area. So you can still, in fact, on the West Mesa, you can still see the remnants of some of these lakes. But the result of this hunting strategy is you're looking for an encounter with a single animal, and you kind of just try to ambush that animal. But as time goes on, and Folsom in particular evolves, people start to move out onto the plains, onto the prairies, and they start to focus on forced stampedes off of a cliff, or where animals are channeled into some sort of corral, maybe made of brush or something like that. The animals are killed in mass, and that's what we can see with these men overlooking these bones here. The later requires large groups of coordinated hunters, and often kills more animals that can be consumed before consumed or processed before decay, or before predators come in and take the animals. The important thing to note is that as we see this transition gradually in the archaeological record, it means there's a lot more people on the landscape. That as time moves on, there's more and more humans living in New Mexico, and they're killing more and more animals, not only as a means to survive, but in many cases they appear to be overkilling those populations, which leads to mass extinction. Human arrival in the New World coincides with the massive extinction event throughout North and South America. That is without a shadow of a doubt. The exact impacts of humans on the environment, though, is still poorly understood. We know they're taking these big animals, but some have argued, well, the environment was changing. A lot of these animals may not have existed for very long into the future anyways. Maybe humans just gave them a little push towards their extinction event. However, that's still debated, but certainly here in the New Mexico area and into the American Southwest, we can see an order of extinction from Gomphthare to mammoth, bison, antiquus. And we can look, it looks like humans are preying on humans prey on the Gomphthare first, it goes extinct. Then they start preying on the mammoth, it goes extinct. Then they start preying on bison, antiquus, and it goes extinct. So there's certainly if not a direct cause and effect, there's certainly an association between what humans are hunting and what's going extinct in what order. And this is not surprising. We see the same pattern when humans reach Australia about 4,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago. So it's not something that's unusual, but it's important to point out that North and South America were changed dramatically by the arrival of humans. And that doesn't mean that humans modified it by starting to domesticate animals and grow crops and stuff like that. No, hunting, Native American hunting, changed the landscape forever. Now, the long and short of this is, of course, if you're dealing with some mass extinction events, and you have this decline of these so-called megafauna, you have to diversify what you're hunting. And so what we come out of at the end of the Paleo-Indian period, as it were, is an increase in human population, which restricts ranges. So you're not allowed to travel over such a great distance to receive these animals, and these animals are not as plentiful as they once were. So plant resources grow in importance as a caloric substance. This leads to what is known as the Archaic period. So if we were to look at the Paleo-Indian versus the Archaic period in a nutshell, one is focused on primarily acquiring large game. Did the Paleo-Indian peoples eat plants and small animals? Yes, they absolutely did. But their lives revolved around trying to acquire large game. In the Archaic period, Native American peoples changed their focus. Instead of worrying about where the next mammoth or bison was, because there aren't any of those anymore, but even deer, they were more interested in where plant resources were, and that the acquisition of game became of secondary importance. There's a lot of different traditions for the Archaic period, so every region has its own tradition. In the Four Corners area, we usually use the Oshara tradition. But all of these are about the same. They go. There's an early, middle, and a late Archaic breakup within that period. And by the late period, groups have adopted agriculture. Definitely adopted agriculture. By the middle to late Archaic period, people have adopted agriculture. So what are these patterns during the Archaic period? Well, they're seasonal for sure. So remember, Paleo-Indian really focused on where large game are throughout the year. Now, Archaic peoples are moving over much reduced ranges, and they're looking primarily for wild seeds and nuts. You kind of, if you're living during the Archaic period, you have to be a jack of all trades. So if you're pursuing native, you're working on acquiring native grasses along a river, you might hunt waterfowl and fish with nets. If you're harvesting mesquite down in the southeast or southern parts of the state, you're probably in rabbit country and you've got a rabbit stick. You know, you're using to take rabbits and other small rodents while you grab as much mesquite as you can. Or if you're hanging out in the pinon stands collecting nuts, you might encounter a deer, which you take with your atlatl. So your strategy in the Archaic period is dependent upon which environmental niche you're currently exploiting. What plant resources are you exploiting, and what animals are in that area during that time period? As a result, projectile points evolve. They get smaller. Atlatls become lighter. They're taking smaller game, but a projectile point size doesn't necessarily have to directly correlate with the size of game. But it's a good indicator, but it's also the importance of these points. If you look back at the slides, you know, you could almost say, well, God, during the Paleo-Indian period, they really made some beautiful projectile points. The things you're showing me here aren't nearly as pretty. Well, you're also looking at how society views these projectile points. During the Paleo-Indian period, you're dealing with a population that they were all consumed with the idea of taking large game. Now it's peripheral. You don't have to make the prettiest point because that's not really where your focus lies. Your focus lies in gathering these plant resources. And there's a lot of regional variability as people have kind of clustered on the landscape around these environments to exploit. They're not traveling as distance in pursuit of large game. And so there's a lot of regional variability occurring during this period. And this is about as good a time as any to kind of introduce our first concept, which is optimal foraging theory. optimal foraging theory assumes that when a hunter is on the landscape, if all game on the landscape were equal, they would take the highest, the easiest to hunt, the highest caloric gain first, and things that take longer to hunt and don't produce as many calories, they take later. So hence, think of it this way. If the world was perfect, you would only hunt trophy bucks, deers. But, you know, the world's far from perfect. And if you're hungry, while you'd love to take a beautiful deer, you know, large male deer, you might have to settle for taking a squirrel. And even then, you might have to kill 10 squirrels to get even a fraction of the caloric intake of the deer. And what this does is it leads to diet breath. So if you're on an archaeological site and you find very few animals, yes, it could mean they're not eating very much, but it could also mean they're focused on one specific animal. If you see a lot of variability in their diet, often it's an indicator of environmental or population stress. So we're going to look at a couple slides of just kind of what some of these diet breaths look like for different time periods. And the first one I have, I think this is the diet breath from High Rolls Cave down in southeast New Mexico. I could be wrong. I tried to pull one that I thought was prototypical of archaic peoples in New Mexico. And what you can see here is quite a bit of different animals already on the list. Your big ticket items are your bighorn sheep, your pronghorn, and your mule deer. But you also got some, and you have bison there in small numbers. But you also got some other things that don't seem like big ticket items, but are actually pretty easy to acquire. For example, turtles. This sounds horrible. Turtles don't really run away, and their best defense isn't really that good against human beings. So turtles are something you usually see eaten up quite a bit. But other things such as prairie dogs and wood rats and squirrels, these are smaller game, obviously. We also have some things that they may not have been eating that made their way into the archaeological assemblage or even contaminated it. You can see quite a bit, a wide array of different kinds of animals being taken at High Rolls Cave during the Archaic period. And of course, as I said, as we get into the later portions of that Archaic period, this dietary stress, so this increased diet breath, which just continues to grow, plant resources are still variable, require some movement around on the landscape. But eventually you see the adoption of plant resources that predictably grow with human hands. So you see the adoption of agriculture, which is going to lead to sedentism or year-round occupation of a single location. In both sedentism, the idea that you stay in one place, not move around on the landscape, and agriculture have major impacts on hunting behaviors. For New Mexico, this is the transition into the Pueblo period. And we see the aggregation of Native Americans into large villages where subsistence is focused almost exclusively on agriculture. A recent study shows that maize corn alone contributes 80% of the caloric intake for Pueblo peoples during this period. So you eat corn, and more corn. And then sometimes you get other things, but most of it's corn. And of course, in the northern Rio Grande, kind of around where we are, this period is really split into 4 areas. Now, once again, the tradition you use in a different area, so for like the Mimbres Valley, is going to be very different. But all of these follow the same pattern, which is, in this case, early developmental, late developmental, coalition, and classic. So little villages, slightly larger villages, big villages by the end. And sometimes these collapse and fall off for various regions. And the dates kind of change depending on which area you go, but the pattern's the same. Small villages, medium-sized villages, large villages, you get the plan. That's usually what the Pueblo period is about. Sometimes that's followed by some sort of collapse due to environmental issues. However, these patterns of, the Pueblo period is classified based on small villages getting bigger and bigger villages in time is not the entire story by a long shot. So as we enter the Pueblo period, as it were, it's important to recognize that some people still maintain what would be considered to us an archaic lifestyle. These hunters and gatherer communities continue to operate throughout the Pueblo period. There are places that agriculture in New Mexico where agriculture just doesn't work. It cannot work. And so while we're blessed, I mean, we live along the Rio Grande here, or along the Jemez River, in areas with relatively high abundance of water. There's plenty of New Mexico which doesn't have any water. And these peoples, while they develop new traits, they maintain that archaic lifestyle. However, that archaic lifestyle continues to evolve. Now that they have these agricultural neighbors, new traits such as raiding and trading with these neighbors begin to develop. So these hunters and gatherers who might take a bison want to trade with their Pueblo peoples to acquire corn. Or if they maybe the hunting and the foraging is really bad that year, they may raid their Pueblo neighbors to get the materials they need. So agricultural products are supplementing hunting and gathering goods, and vice versa. And in some cases, many of these peoples that we identify as Pueblo peoples certainly still fit in to some extent into this nomadic lifestyle. So, for example, we preserve Coronado and Jemez historic sites. I think it's very easy and simple to say the people in Coronado were definitely farmers. The people in the Jemez Mountains, maybe not so much. They seem to, when we look at their archaeology, they farmed, but they also continue to maintain a lot of these hunters and gatherer traits that had served people well for thousands of years up until this point. And we certainly see that in the diet of the Jemez people going into even this Pueblo period. It's during this Pueblo period that we see the transition from the atlatl to the bow. Ron Fields, who I was in grad school with, has really studied this topic at length, specifically at several cave sites, one of which is on Isleta. He has looked specifically at the technology and dated the materials, looking at arrows versus atlatls, spears, darts. So arrows versus darts, and kind of when we think the bow technology took over. And it's really probably sometime in that developmental period, probably in the early developmental between AD 500 and 700. So agriculture comes in first, the bow comes in later. But the bow is adopted, and it's adopted both by the farmers and the hunters and gatherers. So everybody throughout New Mexico transitions to the bow. And some people have argued, or at least speculated, that the transition from the bow was an easy one, because while the atlatl had been really ideal to take large game, people during the Pueblo period aren't focused on large game. Even the hunters and gatherers, those big animals that you really needed that huge dart to take down, are just not on the landscape. Or if they are on the landscape, even your large game, as in deer, are not on the landscape in the same numbers as they had been. So a bow technology, the point shoot, it's easier, requires less training, but it's also more ideal for taking smaller game. And during this Pueblo period, we can certainly see the diet breadth. If you look here, you'll see a lot of different animals being taken during the Pueblo period. And certainly the numbers of animals varies between which site you're looking at. But you'll notice you still have those large game on there, but you have quite a bit more birds showing up in the assemblage, lots more different types of birds. Interestingly enough, you'll notice flicker is pretty much a constant throughout the period. But you're seeing a wider array of high game, high low cost, high reward animals. So like the turtle, which you literally just pick up and flip over, and unfortunately he doesn't defend himself. But you also see the acquisition now in the Pueblo period of some more interesting things. Not only are you seeing more birds, which are very hard to take potentially, but you're seeing a lot more predators show up in the archaeological assemblage. So we see things like bobcat, badger, marten, bear, coyote, wolf, big dangerous animals. So first and foremost, what can we say about this? Well, for most Pueblo farming people farming during the Pueblo period, agriculture ties them to their fields through most of the year. except in winter time. So hunting becomes increasingly focused on the procurement of rabbit and other small field vermin that destroy crops. This is almost, you can think of this as the field and stream epoch of New Mexico history. These fields, you know, if you're mostly concerned with the growing of corn, you need to kill these animals not only because they're a food source, but because they're destroying your primary subsistence activity. And what we see during this time period, in later times we can see in the ethnological record, is community-based drives or rabbit hunts. And certainly we can see these at Coronado Historic Site in the murals here. Here we have a black-tailed jackrabbit being shot with an arrow. Notice he is not being hit with a rabbit stick. It'd be very hard. I know there's an image later that kind of shows young boys killing a jackrabbit with a rabbit stick. Jackrabbits don't act like cottontails. So cottontails kind of stop moving when you startle them. They kind of hide and they stay close. Jackrabbits run real fast. This is a perfect example of how you take a jack. Excellent strategy for the types of animals you're encountering in these fields. But we also see things like this, and I did not use the mural because for cultural sensitivity reasons, I did not use the mural from Coronado Historic Site. I used a contemporary image, but certainly we also see in the archaeological record depictions of deer dance. These deer dances even today are performed in the winter time. These are the times when the fields lay fallow. These are the times when large game such as deer and buffalo can be pursued outside of the field. So these are the times when you're going to get up and you're going to send out those hunting parties into those long areas. And these hunts are often blessed with ritual dances, which we can still see in many of the Pueblo villages today. I think this image here is probably of I think it's supposed to be of a Picuris dancer, but I could be wrong about that. It's representative of deer dancers across Pueblo villages during the Pueblo period. But there's also a spiritual component to many of these things here. Many animals, as we saw in that diet breath, may not be taken for their caloric value at all, but rather to fulfill a spiritual role. For example, most birds are taken primarily for their feathers. And by most birds, I mean non-waterfowl birds. In the case of waterfowl, they're almost exclusively taken for their meat. And so you get sites where you can see the whole wide-scale killing of cranes and ducks and geese, and that's because they're a great meat source. But a lot of other birds were actually taken primarily for their feathers. And certainly we can see that with some of the kind of birds that are showing up in the record during this time period. It is not calorically very cost effective to take an eagle. But if you want an eagle's feathers or an eagle's bones for things, then that might be possible. That might be something more doing. Same thing with predators. I mean, predators, and many times they're more dangerous to hunt than they are for caloric control. Now, you might also be doing that to control predator population to cause your subsistence animals to appear in larger numbers. But certainly when we look at Native American spiritual beliefs, a lot of times these things appear to be taken for reasons. Predator claws and teeth sometimes are symbols of strength and protection. And so perhaps consuming the animal would allow the hunter to be imbued with the spirit of the creature. I'm not saying that with any privileged knowledge, nor am I saying that's exactly the case, but certainly these animals were taken for reasons other than just how many calories they put on the table, with the possible exception of bear. Bear is actually a really good for your calories. Even though it's a dangerous animal, it provides a lot of greasy meat that is, it provides you with a lot of calories. And into this notion, one way archaeologists can look at how good a Native American village is doing during this period is using something known as the Archaeological index. And all these concepts we'll be exploring in a practical sense next week, but I'm just trying to get the concepts out here. So in this case, the Archaeological index is the idea that most animals you take for subsistence activity. So remove all the birds which you may be taking for spiritual purposes or the predators. which you're probably eating them. You can be eating them, but you're also taking them for other reasons. Let's just look at the animals that your primary goal of taking is for subsistence purposes. And those are your artiodactyls, or hoofed animals like deer and pronghorn, and your lagomorphs like hares and rabbits. And you take those and you look at the minimum number of artiodactyl over the minimum number of lagomorphs and artiodactyls. So if you get, and what it does is it gives you a percentage. And if your percentage is really low, it means you're primarily consuming rodents. If your percentage is really high, you're hunting a lot of bigger game that's providing a lot of return for your money. And usually what that does is that gives you a great idea as to the amount of focus on garden hunting, but also the potential for environmental and population stress. So you can use this statistic and look at it through time, look at it across villages, but also look at it in villages where you have multiple components. So how good were they doing at 1300 AD? How good were they doing at 1400 AD? How good were they doing at 1500 AD? And in several cases, like Arroyo Hondo, for example, where this has really been applied, you can actually watch as the people in the village, archaeologically, as the people in the village starve. I mean, you can also see it on the burial populations to some extent too. But you can see the decline, the environmental stress, ultimate leading to that village's abandonment. So these allow you to see how the environment and how it is no longer sustainable to stay at that place. So why did they leave? They left because they were not getting enough food. People had to leave the area. This gives you an idea as to how explaining how people are moving about on the landscape and how the act of hunting, it's not that they're better hunters during the 1300s and then they get worse and then they get worse. No, that's not the case. It allows you to map out how life's going in any given place at any given time. It can be pretty dark, actually, when you think about it, but it gives you a good way of looking at these things. So during this Pueblo period, Europeans arrived. I know it's interesting to say, well, Europeans arrived and the historic period begins. They actually arrived during the later part, in the northern Rio Grande, the classic period, during late in this time period. And these people bring, obviously, new technologies, and we'll talk about those in a second. But the biggest thing they bring is large-scale warfare, conflict, and diseases. And Native American populations at the end of the Pueblo period go way, way, way down. How far down? Well, it depends upon who you believe. But I think it's realistic to expect that at least 75% of the Native American population is lost to disease and warfare as a result of European contact. And I think those numbers are conservative. But the reality is that in many cases, as we move into the historic period, European accounts of the lands, in this mostly occurs elsewhere, but we can see it in New Mexico too, that these lands are of great abundance, and these lands are teeming with wildlife and areas that can be brought under agricultural, brought under farming, and the Native American people have, just can't get to these things. Well, the reality is they had those areas for farming. The animals only rebounded because the Native American population was reduced so dramatically. So unfortunately, what the Europeans are seeing is a result of their own behaviors, the bringing of disease and warfare, not the fact that Native Americans didn't know how to hunt game or didn't know how to farm or didn't know how to work the land. They were experts at working the land. They'd been on the land for over 10,000 years. They knew damn well what they were doing. But unfortunately, their numbers had decreased to such numbers that the animal numbers and the wild game and plant resources had rebounded really a lot. So yes, some of these areas that the Europeans went into, they could sustain very large populations. It was surprising that there were not many more Native Americans. What we're looking at there is an impact from other human activities. So the historic period, which really starts in New Mexico with Oñate in 1598, but for a broad number here, we're just going to say 1600. It is certainly societal change brought on by the settlement of new cultural groups. And we can look at some of those things. Certainly, we see Oñate in the statue. We see a church. That's actually the church in San Ysidro. And then we can see there an encomendero. I think that's actually in the picture is depicting an encomendero in Mexico. But I think you get the point here. We don't need to explore what encomiendas are here necessarily, but to say that some of the Native American population suffered at the hands of the European and Native American colonists that came in during the historic period is certainly without argument. And certainly, when we look at the historic period, we can talk about four broad subdivisions, which are the Spanish colonial, Mexican, American territorial, and New Mexico statehood periods. And I have provided the dates and times of those periods as well. Of course, the first thing that really changes hunting in New Mexico as a result of the historic period and colonization by European peoples is the arrival of domesticated animals. These include cow, pig, goat, sheep, and chicken to New Mexico. And these were all readily adopted into Native American communities. Recent research we did at Jemez Historic Site showed that people outside of the mission were eating goat and sheep probably at least by the 1620s. I mean, these are animals that are readily adopted into those societies. They're a great protein source. They reduce the reliance on hunting wild game, and they bring a lot of calories for their amount of effort put into taking care of these animals. Certainly, the horse is probably the most dramatic and transformed both sedentary farmers and mobile hunters and gatherers. It was a food source for some Native American peoples. It's important to note that the horse was eaten by some. That's not unusual, nor is that something that distinguishes Native American peoples. For example, most Turkic peoples that also worked a lot with the horse, ate horse, drank horse's milk, and so on and so forth. And then in the old world, it's not uncommon for populations to eat horse. In fact, sadly enough, you've probably had horse and not even known it, depending on which generation you're from listening to this this presentation. But certainly it was also valued as a means of transportation, and it allowed these Native American peoples once again to pursue wild game over great distances and still get back to their farms or still get back to their communities and their traditional ranges. So you actually see this kind of resurgence in animal populations at the dawn of the historic period, and then it's going to go take a real big nosedive. The other thing that's going to become much more common with the arrival of the horse's raiding. Some people put raiding into an act of warfare. I'm not sure I would put it in with hunting, but I certainly don't see it as warfare, considering raiding is primarily associated with general subsistence. But certainly raiding during this period goes from before it was largely associated with grain procurement and prestige items. Now raiding could mean taking domesticated animals on the landscape. I mean, a Apache person living in on the plains of eastern New Mexico who come across a flock of sheep, which Pueblo people are taking care of, shooting an arrow in a sheep, which doesn't really run away from a human when it sees them, is much easier than procuring a pronghorn on the plains, for example. So these are a reliable food source that can be taken. And raiding and hunting are not mutually exclusive activities, particularly among nomadic peoples. So if you were to transport back into early 1700s New Mexico and ask an Apache person what they were doing, whether that was really an act of raiding or if they were just taking that goat because it was there on the grass, or a sheep, whatever, they may not view it as any different from hunting. And I think that's a fair assumption. This picture here is just very dramatic of Comanche warriors later on. Okay, so firearms are also introduced during the historic period. However, firearms are one of the last things that become widespread in New Mexico. lack of gunpowder limits the use of firearms during the Spanish colonial Mexican periods. They had them, they didn't use them very much. Instead, what we really see in the archaeological record, both amongst, and I should point this out, both amongst Native American peoples and European colonists, is a reliance on prehistoric weapons, pre-contact weapons that had existed in New Mexico and worked just fine. So we still see lots of projectile points being shot from bows, and of course we know they were using rabbit sticks. These continued to be used in large numbers. The transition, the replacement of the bow and the rabbit stick as your primary hunting tools for Native Americans in New Mexico really doesn't occur till the mid to late 19th century with the import of cartridge munitions along the Santa Fe Trail. If you're looking at the pictures here, you'll notice there's a matchlock at the top. They may have had matchlocks. There may have been a few matchlocks in every Spanish community, but these were not common items. However, by the time you have percussion cap rifles like you see down below at the bottom and cartridged, self-contained cartridges, firearms are starting to replace bows and arrows, even in Native American communities. And this is in the 19th century. The other big change in the 19th century is, of course, the emergence of commercial hunting on a large scale. So commercial hunting had always existed, but New Mexico in the 19th century really gets caught up into the mountain men era, as it were. And both mountain men and Native Americans begin to focus on game primarily for the sale of their hides to markets in the East. So as we look at this picture here, which I think is of a Taos fur trader, though this may also be at what was part of New Mexico at the time, but is now part of Bent's Fort. And I don't remember exactly where I pulled the picture from right off the top of my head. But the picture here, you'll notice that he isn't interested in the meat of the animals. He's interested in primarily the hides, or even if you look by his feet, you'll see some horns and skulls. That was worth money. And of course, Taos during this period becomes a major center for this trade. It's important to note that, when the U.S. government takes over New Mexico, the governor is living up in Taos, even though, you think of Santa Fe as the most important settlement, of course, later Albuquerque being a very big commercial settlement. But in the 1940s, certainly for Anglo-Americans coming to the state of New Mexico, Taos was really the place to be. But of course, that kind of killing and that kind of the widespread use of firearms and commercial exploitation leads to a sharp decrease in game numbers during the 1800s. In New Mexico, elk and bison become endangered, if not extinct. And it's probably very likely they go extinct in New Mexico during this period. There's some people that still believe the elk still lived. I can tell you a story of blah, blah, blah. Now, in the early colonial period, they were hunting bison in the San Luis Valley, in what we would consider today southern Colorado, but was actually part of New Mexico at the time. Bison lived in New Mexico, like right outside Spanish settlements in some cases. Elk were procured. But by the turn of the 20th century, these animals just don't exist. There aren't any stories of bison herds roaming in 1900 New Mexico. And certainly other animals like the pronghorn, antelope, which we saw in the initial slide here, and the beaver, their range has become very, very reduced. They still exist in New Mexico, but they exist in like little clusters. They're not widespread. And the main thing to remember about all of this collapse as it occurs is that hunting is no longer a viable subsistence activity. So we get a response. And the response actually comes a little earlier than the 20th century. It's interesting to point out, we certainly take the conservation movement, and we usually discuss it in terms of Teddy Roosevelt. And I think that's a wonderful idea. The thing I would point out in the second book I'd like to share with you guys right now is Ranch Life and the Hunting Trail was actually written by Teddy Roosevelt long before he was a Rough Rider or president of the United States. So he should be credited for it, but he shouldn't be credited for it just as a president, but rather as a socialite in New York. Interesting things about this book and Teddy Roosevelt's early comments on the American West is he actually points out what animals he thinks are the best and most noble to hunt. And these are really, if you look at this today, these are really the animals that most hunters in the West would consider the top tier game animals. Like you're a real man or a real woman if you take an elk or a bighorn sheep or a mountain goat. Those are the key game animals. Those are the real game animals of the American West. That all comes from Teddy Roosevelt. But certainly under his administration in the early 20th century, we see hunting in public lands managed by federal and state governments. And this really doesn't go back, but it also, certainly Teddy Roosevelt, he transforms, more so than probably any individual in the Americas, transforms hunting from a subsistence activity to a recreational sport, with large game, the hunting of large game representing trophies. So it's not longer, my God, you got a big animal, it'll feed the village for a week. It's now you are a really great hunter, you got a big animal. And the horns and furs are no longer necessarily for the commercial value, but for the hunter's memories of the activity itself. We also see in the 20th century old and new species coming into New Mexico. The wildlife environment of New Mexico has changed rapidly in the 20th century. Elk and bison were reintroduced, while others such as pronghorn were redistributed throughout the state. And we have robust, for example, the crowning achievement of wildlife management is they actually, in the early 20th century, they took some elk from Colorado, they stuck them back in the Jemez Mountains, and now you can go out to the Valles Caldera and see thousands of them. That's a beautiful conservation story. By the turn of the 20th century, there aren't elk in the Jemez Mountains. So all those elk are Colorado migrants in the 20th century, not migrants, brought in, visitors brought in and forced to resettle, colonists as it were, I suppose. Those elk are colonists in 20th century New Mexico. We also saw the Persian ibex appear in New Mexico as a gift from the Shah of Iran. Those were introduced into the Florida mountains and are going strong. And of course, we have Namibian oryx, which is that guy in that lower left-hand corner that you're looking at. Those beautiful. Those are real antelope. Those aren't even pronghorn. That is a African antelope that you see there, and they live all throughout White Sands and represent a beautiful hunting opportunity for the trophy hunter. And then we've also seen as our environment, as we continue to burn fossil fuels and the environment gets warmer and warmer every year, other animals which hadn't existed in New Mexico because it was considered too cold and too far north have all of a sudden decided to join us in the state. And those include collared peccary. So collared peccary had been something hunted by Native Americans in certainly northern Mexico for thousands of years, but we really don't see them on Native American sites until relatively recently. These are animals that are moving into the American Southwest and continue to move north. I don't know if we have pronghorn in Albuquerque now, but it'll only be a couple of years if we don't already. These guys love to live where humans are, and they're extremely industrious. They're also not a true pig. Just so you know, we also have wild pigs. Those wild pigs, interestingly enough, the collared peccary does really good in the American Southwest. The pig, the wild pig, the domesticated pig that now roams across most of the southeastern United States and into Texas, really likes a more marshy environment. It really doesn't do as good in New Mexico as it does in other locations. So hunting today. Consists of a wide array of both traditional practices and modern sporting activities. Commercial hunting continues, albeit in a highly controlled system which no longer has a wide market. You can go out and you can trap beaver, you can go out and trap skunk and whatever you want. Yeah, you can sell it. You can go to a feast day and probably sell your furs, but you're not going to make much of a profit at it. Native Americans participate in all three systems, which include recreational support, sport, hunting for commercial activities. But subsistence really remains unviable for Native American communities. And this is important to mention, is that this traditional practice of Native American peoples providing for their communities through hunting is largely unavailable to them because of the mass extinction events, the commercial hunting practices of the 19th century. So I want to leave you with a couple conclusions. First and foremost, hunting, I hope that you've gotten from this, hunting is cultural expression, which extends throughout the entirety of human occupation in New Mexico. Archaeological evidence is varied, includes not only projectile points, but animal bones and landscape features. We've talked about some of those things here today in broad terms. It's also important to note that as we talked about the bow and the firearm, throughout most of New Mexico's history, the atlatl was the hunter's primary tool. So anybody who says, I'm taking a bow out because I want to do it traditionally the way Native Americans did it, sorta. But throughout most of human history, it was the atlatl. So if you really want to do it the way Native Americans did it throughout most of human history, please try the atlatl. And that goes for all human beings. Even in the old world, the atlatl was a tool for many years. Certainly, archaeologists can infer population growth and environmental degradation through the examination of hunting strategies. So what people are hunting, what they're not hunting, tells us a lot about how healthy their population is and how healthy their environment is. And that hunting is simply not a subsistence practice, but a spiritual, commercial, and even recreational activity, and that hunting continues to this day. We have a buffalo dancer there at Jemez Historic Site's Pueblo Independence Day. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions and comments. As always, I think I've talked my full hour of allotment, so I will try to answer some quick questions right now. But you can always hit me up through email, and I'm happy to help. I chose this picture as the picture to end with specifically because you see the murals on the walls of black-tailed jackrabbits at Coronado Historic Site, and I just wanted to show you what a black-tailed jackrabbit really looks like in the wild. They're enormous. They're amazing animals, and something I enjoy hunting very much.
Matt, we have some things that people have asked along the way.
Okay.
One of them is, in an early slide, 3 people were shown very heavily tattooed. Was that generally true?
I think that's a picture of early, so that is a picture from down south near the El Paso area. And I forget if those are Monzos or Sumas or if those are some sort of Apache groups. Yes, there were groups that tattooed themselves. Of course, we don't know that archaeologically. So let me be honest. Rarely does skin preserve in the archaeological record, and I'm not aware of any skin in the American Southwest that's preserved that shows prehistoric tattoos. But certainly, other cultures throughout the world certainly tattooed themselves, and ethnological accounts or historical accounts of Native American peoples in the Southwest did show that they decorated either with paint or with tattooing. They marked their bodies.
Okay, and then a question about animals, 2 of them. What was the range of the bison prior to the coming of the Spanish, where they found west of the Sandias? And you also mentioned peccaries, but peccaries and javelina are 2 different things. Were they javelina around, or are they an import?
So javelina, javelina, we use javelina in the American Southwest to denote a collared peccary. So technically they're collared peccaries. They have a white ring around their neck that's indicative of collared peccaries. Javelina is actually a hybrid. It's not a scientific word, and sometimes it's used to refer to wild pigs. It's used to refer to a lot of different animals. But what we really have in New Mexico, even though my tag this year says javelina, what they really mean is you can shoot and kill a collared peccary. In fact, if I shot a hog, it wouldn't matter anyways because they're not a protected species in New Mexico.
Okay. Mehdi asked if you could please repeat the reference of the book by Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, so can everybody see me talking now?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
No? Some people can, some people can't. So the one by Teddy Roosevelt that I'm looking at, Los Primeros Mexicanos, this is a reprint, and the book was actually published. This is Ranch Life in the Hunting Trail by Theodore Roosevelt with art by Frederick Remington. It's an absolutely wonderful book about Teddy Roosevelt before his life in politics in the U.S. Army. And it was written by Teddy Roosevelt. I think it was first published in 1888, so I would have to actually look at that date. But really, as far as hunting goes, it talks about ranch life in the noble American West. And now, certainly this being published in New York City, so this is not only capitalizing on the romanticism of the American West, but it's romanticizing the West to Eastern populations. But the last 3 chapters of the book, which I find the most useful for hunting, are talking about specifically the hunting of game. So for example, one of the chapters is called The Game of the High Peaks, the White Goat. And it's his story of hunting the mountain goat, or his, the bighorn sheep, or the round-horned elk. What he's doing is he's creating for people throughout the United States the model that if you're going to come out to the American West and be a true hunter, the game you really should be pursuing is the elk, the mountain goat, the sheep. These animals that are not only are they very hard to come by, they're rare, but they're also very large, reclusive game. And in fact, this is outside necessarily the discussion of New Mexico, but you could actually see the transformation of hunting in America as a result of it. So for example, if you went to Europe and you decided to get a hunting license in Germany, the way they hunt game is very different. For example, Teddy Roosevelt's stories talk a lot about spotting the animal and stalking the animal and then taking a shot from a great distance, promoting marksmanship, which is done very slowly, very quietly, very in Germany, the primary method of hunting a lot of large game is that you're on a reserve where the animals are actually driven in front of the hunters, and the hunters shoot the game while they're moving. That's a very different way than most hunting is done in the Americas, with the exception of small game and stuff like that, taking shotguns. So it's a very different. You can see how Teddy has really defined for most Americans for generations. And these generations include I know I'm talking to an older crowd, but to your parents and even grandparents about, so even if your dad used to love to hunt, he learned to hunt in a way of American kind of hunting.
Okay. Last question is, were roadrunners used as diet or for spiritual purposes? And how common were dogs used as diet?
It depends upon dogs depend upon the Native American society you're talking about. So whether dogs are actually part of the diet or primarily as a guardian and stuff like that, I don't. Are there evidence of butchering dogs in the archaeological record in the American Southwest? Yes. Are there evidence of dogs being treated just like members of the family? Absolutely. So I don't want to get into that one. I don't want to say, well, I don't know of an example. Like I can't just say, well, the Jemez ate the dog and the Keres didn't eat the dog. There's nothing like that. There's no evidence of that. There may be evidence at one Jemez Pueblo of certain cut marks on dog bones, but whether that may be a starvation tactic or something like that, we don't know. I don't think, in general, I think it's safe to assume that while some societies, and certainly some plain societies, definitely ate the dog very regularly, it was probably pretty rare in the American Southwest. As far as whether roadrunners were consumed for food or just for their or taken for their feathers, I'm not entirely sure. My guess is that a roadrunner was primarily killed for its feathers or its plumage. I'm not aware of any butcher marks on roadrunner bones, but then again, I'm not sure how many butcher marks you have to put on roadrunner bones. If you're eating a roadrunner, you probably just pick the bones clean with your teeth. So it's not like an animal that gets heavily processed like a deer or potentially even a dog. If you're going to kill a dog to eat it, you're going to butcher it up. You're going to chop it up. But smaller game like birds, sometimes it's really hard to tell whether they were butchering marks on animals. You can, but it depends upon what section of the animal you're looking at and things of that nature. Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. When we think of, you mentioned the mountain men and commercial hunting. When you think of that, you think of them taking beaver, but is that what they were taking in New Mexico?
They definitely did take beaver in New Mexico. In fact, beaver's actually not that uncommon. I mean, we have beavers out of Coronado Historic Site today, and certainly there are beavers, I would assume, in the Jemez River as well. A beaver is a rodent, and it actually, rodents do good in almost every environment. They're survivors. The first time I saw a beaver in New Mexico, he was dead, bloated up on 550. He had tried to cross the bridge for some unknown reason, the old bridge, and he didn't make it. Since then, I've seen beavers lots of times. But yes, they took lots of. But you should know that as much as we tend to associate the mountain men with beaver hunting and beaver pelts, they took all sorts of pelts. These guys are in essence, they're spreading across the North American continent, destroying large populations of all sorts of wild game. And anything they could take for their furs. And once again, they're overkilling just the same way those Paleo-Indian people are overkilling. Because in many instances, if a mountain man killed a bear, he wouldn't necessarily be able to process and eat all the meat before it went rancid. They don't have those preservation abilities. They did dry meat and stuff like that. But if he's one person out on the landscape and he kills a bear, he isn't going to haul the carcass all over the place or just consume that. He's primarily interested in getting his pelts and moving on. So you're seeing a lot of destruction of the wildlife and game in the American West and in New Mexico during that time period. And of course, the gateway to the Rocky Mountains is at this point is Taos.
And my other question is, did people eat mountain lions?
They still do today.
Okay.
Many hunters eat mountain lion. I'll be honest, I've never eaten it, don't know what it tastes like. I heard it's kind of a whiter flesh, closer to pork than it is to beef or deer. But I've never eaten mountain lion myself. I'm not a predator hunter, so that's not something that I'm real familiar with, but I know they do it. Talking, on that same note, talking about animals that are migrating north with the environmental changes. We also do occasionally get a jaguar in the southern portions of the state, primarily in the boot heel. They're much more common in Arizona. In fact, there was an article, it may have been a year ago or so now, the largest of the jaguars that was known to come into Arizona as part of his territory was shot and killed. But these animals do exist. I've been out on actually surveys where the BLM guys have asked us if we've seen certain traits that they characterized as more common of jaguars than mountain lions. I've never seen those traits. We regularly encounter evidence of mountain lions being in the area, but I've never, and I don't hunt them, so I don't know.
Can you comment on the use of the hairnet that's housed up in Mayak in the Here Now and Always section of their museum?
Oh, not off the top of my head. I'm not really prepared to talk about it. I think it was actually I could be wrong. I think it was for birds or fish, but I don't know. You're talking about the one where it's all strung together with Native American hair. Those are actually very common. Not so common in the American, I should put this out there. Not common in the American Southwest. In fact, that's the only known example that I know of in the American Southwest, but I know other cultures especially, and I think this is outside my area, but I think if you were to go into like the Great Basin, so the areas around Utah, in central and northern Utah, and of course Nevada, I think hairnets were pretty common. And I think they were used primarily for waterfowl and fish.
Oh, thank you.
But I'm speaking off the cuff here. I'm not prepared to really answer that question today.
And Ron asks you, what is your favorite animal to hunt?
It depends. During my life, it's been many different things. I prefer hunting things with a shotgun, so animals that move on the landscape fast and that I don't feel guilty about and that I can hunt regularly with an over-the-counter license are my favorites. Recently, I've become fond of pheasant and quail. And I don't shoot the quail at our site, but I find that I like the taste of quail quite a bit, and pheasant are amongst the most exciting game birds in the world. But I've hunted pretty much everything with limited success, I should say. I mean, I've killed lots of rabbits, but those are entryway animals that are fun to take with kids or with people who've never been hunting before. Those are the absolute best, especially a jackrabbit, because it's so fast and it's so large for its size. You almost, you're walking around a flat desert landscape and you think there's no way there could be an animal that size sitting out in that field. And then it pops up and you're like, oh my God, and it's running 30 miles an hour. And it's an exciting moment. Same thing with birds. Most of the birds I hunt, they flush up. And it's the excitement, and for some extent, it's the excitement of doing that. I have done turkey hunting with absolutely zero success of my own, where I've actually taken a turkey. That requires camouflage and encouraging the turkey, calling the turkey in. Now, if we were hunting turkeys on Coronado, we'd all have a great world experience, because our flock of turkeys at Coronado is second to none as far as I'm concerned. But if you're getting into hunting, first of all, the first thing I would encourage anybody to do is start with small game. Well, first thing I would ask you to do is take a hunter safety course. Learn how to handle a firearm and shoot it properly. Once you feel comfortable you can do that, then I would start with small game. There's many different animals in New Mexico that you can hunt with an over-the-counter license that are fun and nutritious and provide meat for your family. And then, obviously you can put in for big game. Just know that as I learned 2 years ago, I was going for Persian oryx, and in the Florida mountains, that unless you are prepared to drop, to have a hunting party of 20 and drop $10,000 on the experience, you might not be equipped to do some of those more epic hunts. But it's fun. There's a lot of opportunities in New Mexico. And certainly, while I'm not the expert fisherman, fishing is also a gateway into hunting and enjoying the outdoors. And Annie's really the go-to on fishing. I would defer to her on just about any fishing in New Mexico. Other question? Yeah, my favorite probably right now, upland birds. So and primarily in New Mexico, that means quail and it doesn't matter, pheasant.
We appreciate your taking the time to put this wonderful presentation together. It was great.
Thank you. Have a good day, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.